Hello world! Welcome to Learning Java, one byte at a time. This is video 39 in a tutorial series geared at bringing the wonderful wide world of Java to those with little or no programming experience. This video is a continuation of the development of the Booker application, a vehicle appraisal app. In the last video, we continued the construction of our view class, which was going to be part of our model view controller architecture and represent the user interface. First, we had created all of the import statements we were going to need, and then we created all of the private fields that were going to represent each one of the view components. Now, in this video, we're going to need to begin the constructor. However, the constructor is very sizable. It is almost 200 lines of code. And although much of it's redundant, it would be easier to kind of talk through what those redundancies are going to be before we begin so that you can see how easy this is actually going to be. So before we begin, let me start by pulling up the final product that we saw at the very beginning of this particular project, which was our Booker application. And just to tie a correlation between what we were doing in the last video, what we'll be doing in this video, and how that ties together to the final product. And so if I pull up Notepad++, you're going to see the familiar import statements we made 2 videos ago, and then all of the familiar fields that we defined in the last video, including the JLabels, the JText fields, the JButtons, the JRadio buttons, and so on and so forth. And so as you remember, we gave all of these names so that we had ways of referencing them. So we have the vehicle name label, which, as you can see, or if you can guess, correlates to this label right here. This JLabel that says project name, that's the JLabel that's going to be the vehicle name label. And right underneath that, we have the vehicle name text field, which is going to be this particular text field right here. Underneath that, we have the vehicle make label, which would be this particular JLabel, and then the vehicle make text field, which represents this text field right here. Now, as you can imagine, these are arranged on here in sort of a grid layout. And so what we're going to be doing first in the constructor is we're going to have to go ahead and define the panel that we're going to attach all of these visual elements to. And in the very end, we're going to attach that panel to the JFrame that we created that this particular class extends right here. And so in doing so, we're going to need to come up with some sort of layout. The given layout we're going to be using is going to be called a grid bag layout. And the grid bag layout is, while it's the most complex of all of the layouts we could use, for something that's going to have this many pieces to it, it'd probably be the most sensible one, in that it allows us to define the positions of all of these visual elements in a sort of XY grid. And if you could imagine that up in the upper left-hand corner would be an XY location of 0, 0, and the X continues from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and the Y goes down from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. That would mean that this project name we could assume is located in X1, Y1, or X0, Y0. This vehicle name text field would be located in X2, Y0. This new project button would be X3, Y0. And if we continue on, this would be Y1, Y2, transmission would be Y3. So we'll say drive would be considered to be Y4. We'll call this rear wheel radio button to be Y4 or X3, Y4. And so it just allows us to have access to this sort of theoretical grid and to position all of the elements along this grid so that they stay neat and orderly in the JFrame. And so what we're going to need to do is, first we need to define the panel that we're going to be using to attach to this JFrame. We're going to pass through that grid bag layout. And after we do that, we're going to need to come up with a constraints object. And the constraints are going to be how we're able to position these with proper margins and in relation to each other, as well as how much space they're going to take up and their alignment. And so in passing through that, or in creating that constraints object, which we're going to call the grid bag constraints, or we'll name it constraints, then that will allow us to have an access to the constraints on each one of these elements with a single object. Lastly, we're going to have to define what's going to happen whenever they hit the X button. That's going to be the default operation close, and we'll set a final size for this, which will probably be somewhere around 720 pixels left and right. And so if we scroll down here to the end of our field declarations, we can go ahead and begin to define the constructor, which, as you already probably know, is going to be just a simple reference to the class. So view, and in this constructor, allow me to clean this up just a moment here. in this constructor, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and define the title for this. So we're going to reference it with the this keyword. We're going to use a set title method, and we'll pass through the title, which will be Booker Vehicle Appraisal Application. And that is going to be this title that appears up here in the very top of the window. Now after that, we can declare a JPanel. The JPanel is going to be this entire panel right here that all of these visual elements are going to be attached to. And that JPanel we can simply call ViewPanel. And we're going to have to instantiate it with the new keyword to a new JPanel. And then here's where we're going to pass through the layout, which is going to be a instantiation of a new grid bag layout object. And after constructing the JPanel, then we're going to need to define our constraint object, and we're going to have this following a class of grid bag constraints, and we'll just call our object to constraints, and we'll set it equal to a construction of a new grid bag constraints object. Then using the this keyword, we're going to set the default close operation, passing through the JFrame that we've created, or rather we're going to reference the JFrame enum, which is going to be exit on close. And all that means is that when they hit the X button in the upper right hand of this window, that it will close just like a normal window. And lastly, we'll set the size of our view object. We're going to reference it with this, use the set size method, and we're going to pass through 720 wide, 720 long. Just like that. And that takes care of the view object in total. Now we need to begin to go through and assign our elements to this view object. And so each one of these view elements, we'll have to do a couple of things. We're going to have to assign the constraints, then we're going to have to assign their X and Y position. We're going to have to do any sort of extra tweaking to those objects, and then finally we're going to need to add them to the view panel. And now after we do that, for every single one of these visual elements at the very end, we're going to add this entire panel to the JFrame, and you'll see how we do that. So starting with, let's say, first we'll do the logo image right up here. We're going to say that our constraints object is going to have a grid width equal to 4. The constraints on this are also going to have some insets, which are they're basically margins, and we'll do a new insets object, and we'll assign the margins of each side of it equal to 10. And then we're going to reference the view panel, and we're going to add our logo image label that we declared in the private fields, and we're going to pass through that object and the constraints that we've assigned to that object. All right, and so in doing that, we've essentially attached this little logo icon to our panel. So that's one down, several more to go. So now let's go ahead and begin to work on the vehicle name label and the vehicle name text field. So first we're going to redefine our constraints object. We're going to give it a grid width equal to 1. We're going to assign the grid X equal to 0 and the grid Y equal to 1. And so what this is going to do is it's going to line it up here in the 0th column of the x-axis and put it in the first column of the y-axis. And we're going to sort of systematically go through and fill in every sort of address or every sort of intersection of the grid for each one of these visual elements, starting with 0, 1 and going all the way to something like 14, 4, something like that. And so after we have assigned the width and the X and Y locations of our visual element, we're going to do a constraints.fill, and we're going to pass through a grid bag constraints reference to an enum called horizontal. We're going to define some more insets, because anything that we had previously defined with this single object is going to be carried through until we redefine it. And the insets of 10, 10, 10, and 10 work perfectly for this icon. But for all of the rest of these elements, we wanted to have an inset of 5, 5, 5, 5. And so once we declare it here, that's the only time we're going to have to declare it for the rest of these elements. So it's going to be insets equal to a new insets object. And we're going to pass through 5, 5, 5, 5 as the margins for that. Then we're going to go ahead and add the vehicle name label with these constraints. And following that, we can redefine the constraints so that we can reposition for the next component. The constraints grid X will be equal to now 1, and the constraints grid Y will still be equal to 1. And now we can add to the view panel the next element, which is going to be the vehicle name text field. And we'll also pass through the constraints object that we defined. Alright, so that takes care of now the icon, takes care of the vehicle name label, it takes care of the vehicle name text field. Now we're going to need to work on the new button and the load button. And so we're going to continue to reuse the same constraints object. So let's define constraints and reposition it now. Grid X is going to be equal to 2. Grid Y is going to remain equal to 1 because we're going to stay in that same column. And we're going to do a view panel dot add. Now it's going to be the vehicle new button with the constraints object. I'm going to resize this just a little bit so we can see everything we're typing. And now we can do the same thing for the load button. So this is going to be redefining the constraints object. Grid X is going to be equal to now 3 because we're moving over a column. The constraints on grid Y are going to remain equal to 1. And we're going to add to the view panel our vehicle load button, passing through the constraints as an argument. Okay, so that takes care of everything that we have here in this first row. So now what you're going to see is we're going to redefine the constraints grid Y to 2, and we're going to start over grid X at 0. That way we can begin in this next column and begin to work on the make label, that text field, the model label, and the model text field. And we'll continue down the line, progressing through all of the columns and rows until we get to the very end. And you'll notice that most of these visual elements are going to carry the same sorts of properties, just different locations. All right, so now that we have the vehicle load button, let's go ahead and work on the vehicle make button. That's going to be constraints grid X is now going to be reset to 0. Constraints.grid Y is going to be equal to 2 because now we're going to be in the second row. And we're going to attach to the view panel our vehicle make label with the constraints objects, like so. Next, we're going to move the grid X over to position 1. Grid Y is going to remain in position 2. And we'll add to the view panel the vehicle make text field. All right, so now after that, redefine the constraints grid X. This is going to be equal now to 2. Constraints grid Y is going to stay positioned at 2, and we're going to add to the view panel, and that's going to be the vehicle model label with the constraints. And I just now noticed I forgot to pass through the constraints object here. All right, so we have that proper. And after the vehicle model label, we can do the vehicle model text field. So redefine our constraints, Grid X is going to be equal to 3. Grid Y is going to remain at 2. And the view panel, add vehicle model text field along with the constraints. Perfect. So now we have now finished the row that contains the image icon, the row that contains these elements right here, and the row that contains these elements here. So we're going to start back off at x equals 0, and now y is going to equal 3. And we're going to start with the year label, the year text field, so on and so forth. And so it's sort of grueling, but we're just going to go ahead and plow through this together. So constraints are going to be grid X reset to 0. Constraints grid Y are now going to be set to 3. And we're going to add to the view panel. It's going to be the vehicle year label and the constraints object, like so. Next, we're going to need to have our constraints set grid X equal to 1. Constraints grid Y remains at 3. And the view panel is going to have added the vehicle year text field with the constraints object. Constraints grid X equal to 2. Constraints grid Y remain at 3. And the view panel gets added. This is going to be the vehicle base cost. And the label, in fact, constraints grid X is going to be now 3. Grid Y remains at 3. And we're going to add to the view panel the vehicle base cost text field along with the constraints. Okay, so that's that row done. Now we're going to move down to the transmission field. So we'll start with the transmission label and then we'll add those radio buttons. It's going to be constraints grid X, reset that to 0. Constraints grid Y is now going to be 4 because we're in the next row. Add to the view panel the vehicle transmission label with the constraints object. Redefine our constraints grid X, set that equal to 1. Constraints grid Y is equal to 4. View panel.add. This will be the vehicle transmission radio button for manual. So the vehicle transmission manual radio button and our constraints object. And grid X, move it over to 2. Grid Y stays on 4. Add to the view panel the next radio button, which is going to be the vehicle transmission automatic radio button, along with the constraints object. Next we have the constraints grid X equal to 3. Grid Y stays on 4. And the view panel, add the vehicle transmission EV radio button with the constraints object. And that's going to be everything in that row. So now we can move Y down and begin on the drive row. Actually, before we do that, we had mentioned earlier that we need to have a way of distinguishing how each one of these 3 buttons are going to be uniquely identified. So how does the application know that only one of these should be selected at any time? And that has to do with the button group that we defined earlier that we can now make the assignment to. And so before we move on to the next column, this would be a good place to make the assignment to that button group. And so let us take our vehicle transmission button group, and we're going to add the vehicle transmission manual radio button And we'll do the same thing for the automatic. And then we'll do the same thing for the EV, like so. So now that we've added those three buttons to that one singular button group, that's how the application is going to distinctify them. All right, now we can continue on with the drive row. So that's going to be redefining our constraints grid X. This is going to be reset to 0. Our constraints grid Y is now going to move up to 5 in the 5th row. And then we can add to our view panel the vehicle drive label with those constraints. We will reset the grid X, now equal to 1. Grid Y stays equal to 5. And add to the view panel. This is going to be another radio button, so this is going to be the vehicle drive front wheel drive radio button. I believe the front wheel drive comes first. Yes, so it'll be front wheel drive, then rear wheel, and then all wheel. Pass through the constraints object. Redefine grid X to 2. Keep grid Y on 5. And then add to the view panel the vehicle drive rear wheel drive radio button with those constraints. Redefine X to 3. Keep Y on 5. And then add to the view panel vehicle drive all-wheel drive radio button. All right, and then just as before with the transmission, we need to add those radio buttons to the button group. So we're going to make a call to the vehicle drive button group. We're going to add first the vehicle drive front wheel drive radio button. And we'll do the same thing. Access the button group, call the add method, and pass through the vehicle drive rear wheel drive radio button. And we'll do the same thing. Access the button group, call the add method, and pass through the vehicle drive all-wheel drive radio button. So now those three radio buttons are added to the button group, and the application will know that only one of them can ever be uniquely selected. So we're kind of coming right along here. So let's move on to the next row and define the, looks like to be the safety features. And these will be the checkboxes. So we're going to redefine our constraints grid X, reset that to 0, redefine our constraints grid Y. We're going to move that down to 6, and then we're going to add to our view panel the vehicle safety features label with those constraints. Redefine grid X equal to 1. Redefine grid Y, or rather keep grid Y set to 6. Whoops, set that to 6. And then add to the view panel. This is going to be the vehicle airbag, or the vehicle airbags checkbox with those constraints. Redefine grid X to be 2. Keep grid Y equal to 6, and then add to the view panel the vehicle ABS checkbox. And then constraints grid X equal to 3. Constraints grid Y stays at 6, and we're going to add to the view panel the vehicle rear view camera checkbox with those constraints. Okay, so that's going to be everything that we need in that row, and we don't need to assign any groups because the checkboxes can be selected as multiples. So we can move on to the next row and do the grade of the vehicle. So constraints, grid X restarts at 0. Constraints, grid Y, we're going to move down to 7. And the view panel, we are going to add the vehicle grade label with those constraints. Grid X, we're going to reset to 1. Constraints grid Y stays at 7. And the view panel gets added the vehicle grade economy radio button with those constraints. Grid X is now 2. Grid Y stays at 7. View panel gets the vehicle grade standard radio button with those constraints. Grid X is going to be 3. Grid Y stays at 7. And the view panel gets the vehicle grade performance radio button. Just like so. And now that we've added the performance radio button, we can add those 3 buttons to the vehicle grade button group. So we'll call the vehicle grade button group and add the vehicle grade economy radio button and the standard radio button and the performance radio button. So now those 3 buttons are added to their respective button group, and that's going to be everything in that row. So now we can move down to the next row, which is going to be the mileage and previous owners components. So just as before, we restart constraints grid X back to 0. We're going to move down grid Y one more step to 8, and we're going to add to the view panel, this time the vehicle mileage label with those constraints. Add 1 to grid X, keep grid Y at 8, and add to the view panel the vehicle mileage text field. Add a space there, okay. And then we're going to move our grid X one more up to 2, keeping grid Y on 8. And we'll add the vehicle previous owners checkbox with those constraints. And grid X, we're going to move over to 3. Grid Y stays on 8. And we'll add to the view panel the vehicle previous owner's text field. And we'll pass to the constraints. Now I have that one coming up as plural text field, so there may be a mistake up here. Let's scroll back up and make sure that I didn't misname that. Vehicle previous owners text fields. Yeah, that's why that came up like that. Let's correct that before we get any further. Should just be text field. And I'll fix that down here as well, text field, just for consistency. That could have been a problem. Okay, so now that we've got that entire row, we can go and add the luxury features, which are going to be this row right here, luxury features. So let's continue on. It means that we restart grid X back at 0. We increment grid Y to 9, and we add the view panel, vehicle luxury features label with those constraints. increment grid X to 1, keep grid Y on 9, add to the view panel the vehicle, and this is going to be the keyless entry checkbox. Grid X moves up to 2, grid Y stays on 9, we add to the view panel the vehicle, it's going to be premium sound checkbox. And then grid X increments up to 3, grid Y stays on 9, and the view panel gets added the vehicle GPS navigation checkbox, like so. And that's going to be everything in that row. All right, so we can move down to the next row, and that's going to be the, let's see, the class. All right. So just as before, constraints, grid X starts back off at 0. Constraints, grid Y gets incremented to 10. The view panel, we're going to add our vehicle class label, passing through those constraints. Then we increment X. We're going to keep Y. On 10, and then we're going to add to the view panel the vehicle class, and I believe that it's going to be in order of utility, then sport, then luxury. So let's do class utility with the constraints. Then sport, and then vehicle class luxury with those constraints. All right, and I believe that's going to be everything in that row, so we can continue down. But since those are going to be radio buttons, let's not forget to add those to our button group. So we will take the vehicle class button group. We're going to add, if I can type, first the vehicle class utility. Then we will add the sport, and then we will add the luxury. So now those 3 buttons are added to the button group, and we can move down to the next one, and that's going to be the commission rate and the accident history checkbox. So that's going to be the label, the text field, and the checkbox. So we're going to increment our grid X, or rather we're going to reset grid X to 0 and increment our grid Y to 11. Add to the view panel the vehicle commission label with the constraints. Let's increment our X, keeping Y on 11, and add to the view panel the vehicle commission text field, passing through those constraints, and then we will increment X one more time to 2, maintain Y on 11, and then add the vehicle accident history checkbox with those constraints. Okay, and getting close to the very end now. Looks like the last row, or the last 2 rows, because we still have the text area to add that's going to be invisible. So the second to last row, we're going to have the 2 buttons. So let's go ahead and reset our grid X to 0, increment our grid Y to 12, and then add our vehicle generate add button with those constraints. We'll increment our grid X to 1. And actually, as I've just noticed, these buttons are actually centered to the second and third column. And so rather than resetting this grid X for the generate add button to 0, we're going to make this one 1. And then for the next button, the save project button, we're going to set this one to 2. And so we have column 0, column 1, where that generate add button's in, column 2, where the save project button's in, and then column 3 that's being unused in this row. So that's going to be grid Y on 12, view panel, add, vehicle, save button with those constraints. All right, and now the very last one that we need to add is going to be the text area that pops up that's going to be populated with the entire dynamically generated sales ad at the very end. It's invisible right now because there's nothing in there, but once you hit the generate ad button, it takes all of that, runs it through the Blue Book, gets an appraisal value, parses through a pre-written sales ad, and then prints that ad to a text area that's going to appear right here. So we're going to need to do just a little bit of magic for that, but let's first add that visual component. So that's going to be constraints grid X. We're going to reset that to 0. Grid Y, we're going to increment to 13 to bring it down to the next row. Then we're going to do constraints dot grid width, and we're going to set it equal to 4. We want it to stretch across all 4 columns. And then we're going to do a constraints grid height and set it equal to 6. Then we're going to do a constraints fill, and that's going to need to be set equal to a grid bag constraints enum of both. We want it to fill the X and the Y. And then we're going to add that to the view panel, and we called that the vehicle advertisement text area with those constraints. And then what we're going to do is take the vehicle advertisement text area. We're going to set the line wrap to true because we want the single line of string text to wrap as it hits the edge of the text field to kind of fill it in from left to right. We're going to access it again, and we're going to set the wrap style, set wrap style word equal to true. So we want to actually not to break off in the middle of a word. We don't want it to wrap just the characters, but we want once the word hits the overflow in the X, we want that whole word to jump down to the next line. And then the vehicle advertisement text area, set visible equal to false, because we don't want it to be shown when we initially set up this component. We want it to become visible after the generate add button is hit. Okay, and so now the very last part of this is we're going to use this to reference this this view constructor, and we're going to add all of this to our view panel like so. And then, believe it or not, that is the end of the constructor. And so quite a lengthy video, and there's really not quite a way to unit test this just yet. We have to do a couple more things. We have to come up with some methods before we can instantiate this, but just as soon as we have enough here that we can instantiate it, we will get a chance to see what it looks like as its final view element, to see that we have everything lined up and it looks good. Otherwise, this was sort of a lengthy video. Hopefully everything in this was fun and educational. The grid bag layout is one of the more complex layouts, and unfortunately the documentation on it is not super clear, but there are plenty of examples out there on the internet that you can use to reference and to get a good feel for how that layout works. Hope this is fun and educational and exciting, and we can't wait to see everyone back again in the next video. Thank you so much and have a wonderful night.